Good evening and welcome to the show. This is the First Amendment, historically speaking, and I will be your host. My name is Brother Fredrick Douglass, and again, it is our pleasure to come before you, and we thank UPTV for allowing us the chance to come before you and forward what we think is esoteric information that will raise the mass of critical consciousness amongst Americans, if you will, and more specifically, to speak to the population that lots of times is educated in a sense where they don't get esoteric information. So those who are overwhelmed with the prospects and the tenets of Western education, it is that group that we intend to reach, along with the mass, if you will, a larger audience. So today, I want to discuss what we know as Black History Month. So we're going to go over an origin of Black History Month, how it started. We're going to also go over, a brief history of what it's entailed and what it means today contemporarily. And I want to pose a very serious question for those of you all who happen to be watching, and ask yourself this in a very vital manner. Does Black History Month need a makeover? That's our overarching question for today. Does Black History Month and the thoughts that go into Black History Month, as well as the history and the origin, does it all need a makeover? And finally, we will end with some thoughts about what's going on in our society today. So when we talk about the origin of Black History Month, then we need to look no further than one of our premier giants in history, social reform through history, and community development, is one of our greatest historians, one of our greatest thinkers, one of our greatest minds, one of our greatest black men on the planet ever, Dr. Carter G. Woodson. Dr. Carter G. Woodson, and the G is for Godwin and not Goodwin, so it's Dr. Carter Godwin Woodson, which in turn gives us some insight when we look at that middle name. Not Goodwin, but Godwin. And I say before you that some of these things that we look at are by no means by accident. So his middle name, tied into God and Godwin, should be paramount in our thought when we think about Dr. Carter G. Woodson. So don't let the G stand with just a period for some abbreviation. No, it's Carter Godwin Woodson. And that idea, in turn, sparks a thought about his connection to blacks, to Black history, and what he did with the thought. Of course, it's historical now, but imagine his thoughts when he brought about Black History Month now. Let's say what we know it as, but prior it was Negro History Week, February 1926. So when we think about that time and how history was during that time, it was important that blacks during that time have a space where they could discuss their history, because it was a particular time where not only were blacks written out of history, they were written into history as inferior. And it was backed up during this time. We're talking 1926. It was backed up this time legally, systematically, in education, de jure by jury, de facto by social stance, that there was an inferiority. So to combat that, and that thought, Dr. Carter Godwin Woodson said that we should be able to have a specific time where we discuss the accurate accomplishments of blacks in the history of America. Now, the first thing that those of us who don't quite understand his thoughts would say, well, why did they give us the shortest month of the year? Well, let's clear that up and let's remove all the misnomers. Historically, the month of February to Dr. Carter G. Woodson was the idea of two famous men that he had a love for. One was the great emancipator, or the so-called great emancipator, the 16th president of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, and also his love for Fredrick Douglass. Now, the idea of Fredrick Douglass that ties into Dr. Carter G. Woodson is that he had an affinity for Fredrick Douglass and his scholarship, his tenacity, the way that he conducted himself on the world stage as a presence and a symbolic presence for blacks in America and beyond. So Fredrick Douglass's birthday was in February. So for us to be very clear, one of the staples to have slavery be as successful as it was, the transatlantic slave trade, was to never have the slave to know what their name was, not just their original name, but their birth dates as well. So Fredrick Douglass was born in February, and like many other slaves during that time, his birthday was tied to an event. His birthday was tied to a season. So he was born during February, and his grandmother, who loved him dearly, and they had a great relationship, who raised Fredrick Douglass, gave him the birth date February the 14th in connection to Valentine's Day, because she said that was her sweetheart. So if we understand what Dr. Carter G. Woodson was attempting to do, he was attempting to accurately inject the accomplishments of blacks in America into the American history so they could have points of reference to allow them to participate in the American body politic as a entity that would be productive. So now, in February 26th, that doesn't tell a story of Dr. Carter G. Woodson. Prior to that, 1915, he creates a SALA, which is a connection of a group of people, and he was the founding person, 1915, at the University of Chicago. So prior to him creating Negro History Week in February 1926, he had a long history of educational and social accomplishments. He was from a part of West Virginia where during his youth he couldn't go to school the entire year, so he would go to school part-time, work the fields part-time, so he doesn't finish high school until 20. And folks say, really, he didn't finish high school until 20? Well, he didn't start high school until he was 17. So we show the brilliance. And years later, he comes back to that same high school and becomes the principal. So his brilliance is all around us. Now, when we talk about black history, we begin to talk about dates, history, names, and things that we, for the most part, have been given. Nothing that we have created amongst ourselves. Now, what makes it very interesting is that with Dr. Carter G. Woodson in 1926, he's not only criticized by bourgeois black politicians, if you will, those who had connections to the center of society and that power, he's criticized by mainstream blacks and for the reason of using 1 week. Well, I think it was groundbreaking. Between 1926, when we have Negro History Week, we don't have Black History Month until 1976. So between 1926 and 1976, we know it as Negro History Week, and it's expanding. So now the thought of how important it is has taken hold to the masses of blacks, and they've accepted it, they've absorbed it, and it's become theirs. Understood that between this time, the word Negro loses its polish, loses its particularity, and becomes a negative connotation for the masses of blacks. So by February of 1976, we begin to see that the name has changed from the Negro, which is tied to an inferiority complex, to the Black History Month in 1976, which covers the idea of civil rights, it covers the idea of black power, and it takes us to the 70s. So now historically we are becoming accurate, and we're moving along just fine. But in between, there are nuances that we must discuss. Well, what did Dr. Carter G. Woodson leave behind? He left behind a legacy for us to continue and continue to shape it for whatever time is meant and the best that we can get out of it. So if the best that we could get out of it in February 1926 was a week and now we have a month, then this should still be evolving. So I go back to the question for today. Does Black History Month need a makeover? Well, that's a very serious question. And I think he answered, Dr. Carter G. Woodson answered this question in 1933 when he wrote the classic, The Miseducation of the Negro. Now, this is perhaps his most popular literary piece. And what was he doing with this piece? The Miseducation of the Negro. He was making it quite clear that during the time of formal education for blacks, which they had been denied that up until the ending of slavery, during Reconstruction, he's talking about literally those who are coming in to educate blacks and for what reason. And then in 1933, what he says is it becomes a miseducation. Well, it was a miseducation all the time. That he well knew. But he documented it. He put a stick in the mud in 1933. And he says what? It's a miseducation. And if you think about the importance of the title, symbolically what it said in 1933, it made lots of people uncomfortable, especially the bourgeois black formally educated population. I've heard some scholars say, well, yeah, he was just scolding, he was just being mean, and he shot at everybody. Well, at that time, and as well as today, it does need a makeover, and those who are the bourgeois black population, the most formally educated, the failure of the Negro intellectual, need to be brought down in front of the public. They need to be chastised because of what they're doing and what they're not doing and how they hide this under the idea of formal education. Well, let's think about a few entities that Dr. Carter G. Woodson made plain that were failing. And let's look at them now. Well, let's think about just a few. Let's think about Afro-American history departments in higher education. Let's think about museums, and let's think about black cultural centers. If we look at those three entities and we connect it to Dr. Carter G. Woodson, which there would be none of these three entities if there wasn't for Dr. Carter G. Woodson's thought. If we look at the idea of Afro-American history departments, well, it's under assault in higher education. It's constantly under assault since its inception. 1969, San Francisco State, and the great warrior, Dr. Nathan Hare. I salute you, Dr. Hare. And realistically, let's look at what they do now, especially since we're here in the Champaign area and have such an august university that has such an august African-American study department. Well, I question everything that comes from that department. Yes, there are some brilliant men and women who work in that department, and those who work diligently to raise the masses of us to higher intellect, academically and socially. Yes, they are. But from the top down, and no department can be any better than its leadership, then we need to look to the leadership, Dr. Ron Bailey. And how do we look to him? Well, lots of us look to him as this groundbreaking scholar. We have to be far more critical of the past, and we have to be far more critical when we look at these people's background. Well, this is not an assault, but this is the truth. And we don't have to lie because the truth is bad enough. I've heard him say on many occasions that his mentor was Ernest Withers. And for those of y'all who don't know, Ernest Withers was the cameraman and the lens to the civil rights movement. And as it's been revealed over the years, Ernest Withers was a paid FBI, CIA, clandestine informant of Dr. King, along with Solomon Jones, his chauffeur. So the person who took the pictures, the person who drove Dr. King to these places were both FBI informants. And for one to have an FBI informant as a mentor, then we need to look at this person for what he does and how he got this position. Well, how they got the position is secondary to what they'll do to keep the position. So now, when we say African American Studies Department, last year they removed the African American Studies Department at Western Illinois. Just got rid of the African American Studies Department at Eastern Illinois. So no, you will be able to take African American study classes in higher education, but no longer will they hold the same resolve, taught by the same groups of people with the same mindset as their inception. So it's not only being watered down, it's being controlled by those who have been raised and controlled by secret government agents. And the University of Illinois cannot get around it because of the head of that department. There's no way around it. That is just the facts. So then we look to museums and African American history and what Dr. Carter G. Woodson was saying with Negro History Week. And we look no further than the DuSable Museum in Chicago, the oldest and at one time the largest African American museum. And now when we look at it, right now to this day, the core values and the fundamental structure have been rewritten in the last 2 years. And now it's controlled by Jewish philanthropy, more so than it ever was. So when we look at these places, African American Studies Department, museums that house our history, all controlled by philanthropy, which is in turn curbing the narrative and painting a counter narrative. So it's just like taking a picture, bam. And when you take a picture, who's the first person you look for? Automatically, you look for yourself. And if you're not in that picture, then you're forced to look to someone else. And when you're forced to look to someone else, that means someone else is covering the narrative, someone else is telling the narrative, and someone else is indeed making and lessening, marginalizing figures, paradigms, thoughts, and the importance of what will make blacks in America and beyond connect to their true history and their original position as the original man and woman, or more specifically, the aboriginal man and woman on the planet. Well, these are not discussed in the history courses. You won't find them in the history museums. So we have a brand new history museum in Washington, very close to the White House. Isn't that ironic? Because slaves built that White House, built the Congress, built the Capitol from 1793 to 1802. Slaves, $5 a month, built the Capitol. So does black history need a makeover? And let's go to black cultural centers. There's one here in Champaign at the University of Illinois with a new director who I do not know. Heard that he's a nice man. Actually had a chance to meet him in passing, and I wish him the best of luck because his task is huge. His task is to make this cultural center relevant under the auspices of the control of a university. So that's a great task. And the jury is just out right now about what he's able to do and what he will do. But if we look at cultural centers in general, they are normally controlled by the philanthropy of folks who are other than black. So for Black History Month at the Cultural Center, we will have a discussion, Black Lives Matter. Even here, we will have footage of very important film series. The death of Fred Hampton, the assassination of Fred Hampton. Excellent point for folks who have never heard of it. But none of the Hamptons were brought here to speak on it. Fred Hampton Jr. was not brought here to speak. His mother was not brought here to speak. So at best, that information is lacking a narrative that would clear up the cobwebs of history and put us in a better light as a good people. So we have to be very honest. Does Black History Month need a makeover? Indeed. Because we normally get Rosa Parks, who is a brilliant lady, so we don't get her entire story. And we never get Rosa Parks tied to Claudette Colvin. And then we always get Dr. Martin Luther King. But not the Dr. Martin Luther King that I well know from 67, from April 4th, 1967 until April 4th, 1968, his death that opposed the abominable war in Vietnam. No, we get the Dr. King that says, I have a dream. Not going on with that soundbite at that March on Washington speech where he says that America, he refuses to believe that America does not have the right mind for the black person in America, and says that came back funds, insufficient funds. We don't run that line. And then now you get Malcolm X. Isn't that ironic? That you get Rosa Parks, who at one time in the South was one of the most hated figures because of her stance. Dr. Martin Luther King, who was assassinated and considered one of the most dangerous men on the planet and one of the most hated men on the planet. And Malcolm X, brother Malcolm X. How does Malcolm X, from the stance that he took his entire life, become one that you will put on a stamp and recognize his brilliance? Well, the justification in that is that you look at Malcolm prior to him going, after him going to Mecca, and you separate those two. The Malcolm that was in the Nation of Islam and the Malcolm that was excluded and expelled from the Nation of Islam. And which one are you in love with? Which one is forced amongst us to become Malcolm, to make Malcolm a hero? It's definitely not the piece where he studied under the most honorable Elijah Muhammad. It's the piece where he was removed from the Nation of Islam and he becomes this international figure. Why did that happen? Why wasn't he an international figure when he was studying under the messenger? How do we look at this? Yes, this needs a makeover. We need some truth. We need the light of understanding under the searchlight of truth. And we just not getting it, and it won't happen, and it won't come from the formally educated crowd. It furthermore won't come from African American studies departments, black history museums, and black cultural centers. It's impossible. It's literally impossible. And I don't want you to think that these people mean all bad, and they mean to literally derail our education, if you will. I don't think that. But I think the masses of them who hold positions have been for years compromised for their own material culture, for their want of acceptance amongst their open enemy. So we have to be very careful when we say, what do we need? We need you to understand that in 1963 or 1964, when Malcolm goes to Mecca, that's not the first time that he goes to Mecca. So now they have you believing that just because he said that he saw Muslims that were blonde-haired and blue-eyed. Well, you have to realize this. Malcolm's position was Mosque number 7 in Harlem, which is only a car ride away from the United Nations. So Malcolm was well-versed. See, that's limiting Brother Malcolm. He was well-versed in international affairs. His stance, with, the tragedy with Patrice Lumumba, lets you understand that he has international status. But let's get back to Brother Malcolm. As a believer and a student of the most honorable Elijah Muhammad, yes, Brother Malcolm became a hypocrite. That's without question. But see, that's the Brother Malcolm you want to study. So how do you say that you love the leaves and the fruit of the tree, but you hate the root? So at African American studies, at these African American museums, at these African American cultural centers, you'll see them lift Brother Malcolm, but you'll see them erase his teacher, the most honorable Elijah Muhammad. That is indeed criminal. And it happens every day, especially at these three entities. So you don't want to discuss that without the most honorable Elijah Muhammad, you got Detroit Red. That's all you got. How did he get to be an international figure? And then who assassinated him and for what reasons? So do we need a makeover? Yes. We need a makeover that will on Black History Month, that would allow our children to study some people outside of what they're forced to study in formal education. Yes, it's important that they study Jacob Carruthers. Yes, it's important that they study C.R.L.L. James. It's important that black students understand that there's a difference between Fredrick Douglass and Martin Delany, and we should be discussing that. And they need to know that between when Dr. Carter G. Woodson injects Negro History in 1926, it's at the tail end of the eugenics movement from 1900 to 1929, when the scholarly scientific community of Western education, white men are creating an inferiority for blacks that will be taught in a formal educational system. So yes, we do need a makeover. And if the instructors and those who are in positions of leadership at these three entities are not discussing this way, then they have proven to you where they sit. And what Dr. Carter G. Woodson says in the Miseducation of the Negro, chapter 1, in the first paragraph. And the title of this chapter is The Seat of Trouble. And he talks about the seat of trouble, meaning where the trouble starts, and here's the center point of the trouble. He said, formerly educated Negroes have a contempt for the rest of their brothers and sisters. Now, the part of brothers and sisters, I am paraphrasing, but he says, formerly educated Negroes have the attitude of contempt. That's a quote. So, when we speak of that, and we don't teach that in a way that challenges that formerly educated bourgeois population, then we indeed miss out, and our children miss out, and we suffer individually and collectively, and that's why they have the air of contempt towards their elders. Now, Black History Month is indeed important, and we need to be sure that we can look at it in a different way with our own makeover, taught by our own people who are unafraid and prepared to teach this in a non-compromising scholarly manner and be able to teach it to those who will never pick up a book. Do you have those skills coming out of a formerly Western education? Now I want to move on and explain to you in a very brief time about Chicago and its situation. Yes, we know about Chirac and the murders that go on there. But let me inform you, Donald Trump, the president right now, is intending to send in the National Guards. Now, the most honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan has been warning us for 30 years that they were coming, and they are on their way. But I warn the president that if you send the military in to slaughter the masses of those young black people, then God's wrath will swing upon America in a way that you have never seen in your life, not to this day. Look what's happening in California with the rain. You'll see more rain, more hail, more snow, more earthquakes. So be very careful, Mr. President. We understand that your presidency is unique and what they say outside of the box. We do understand that. But you have to be very careful as you deal with God's people. So to you all in Chicago, you've been warned. Brothers and sisters, they are on their way. They are coming. And you have to be able to protect our young and our children. Yes, they are on our way. Ladies and gentlemen, this information may in no means change your mind. But because truth and you are so very important to me, I just thought you ought to know and hear it from somebody who's non-compromising and been raised that way. I remain with esteem and respect, Brother Fredrick Douglass. Now, how about that? Run, tell,